And let's not underestimate species' natural adaptation responses. Species have all sorts of ways of persisting. There's phenotypic plasticity. All that means is, this is very interesting. The new research is coming out about evolution and microevolution. This idea we've all been brought up with, that the genome is a genetic program. How many times have you heard that? We're genetically programmed. Well, the latest research is saying that analogy is false. The genome is not a genetic program. It's a template. And what emerges, that's what the phenotype is, what we see, is actually a product of and is conditioned by the environment that the genome develops in. So there's a lot more adaptive capacity in species than what we have tended to think. A lot of our species have a capacity for large-scale movement. They can change their behaviour, especially animals, and they form new ecological relationships quite, easily in many cases. But nonetheless, bad stuff is going to happen. There are species that are going to be threatened, there are species that are going to extinct, and there are ecosystems that are going to change in ways which are bad for one way or another. So in addition to policies on ecosystem-based mitigation and adaptation, we need policies that directly tackle the negative impacts of climate change on biodiversity. But that's got to be framed by an understanding of what nature needs, or if you like, Isla was talking about how nature actually works, not how we would like it to work. So there's 3 points I want to make that I think need to be framing our thinking. We really can't take our eye off what's really the main game when it comes to wildlife, and that's the native vegetation-based habitat resources. This is the key to animal species persistence. Most animals get most of the habitat resources they need: food, shelter, nesting, reproduction, from the vegetation. So, and we have all sorts of ecological theory that point to the importance of the quality and condition of the habitat as well as the area and amount of it. So, let's not forget really what the main game is. The main game for wildlife conservation is really their habitat, and their habitat really comes down to native vegetation. And the second, and this is really building upon what Isla was saying about resilience thinking, but if we start to look at the role of the functional role of biodiversity in that resilience thinking, and I was involved in another report for the Convention on Biological Diversity which looked at this relationship between forest resilience, biodiversity and climate change. As Isla noted, one of the reasons why ecosystems can persist is because of the different kind of things that species do in ecosystems. And this is what's really an important nuance to understand is ecosystems have to be more than resilience. Resilience is one system characteristic. And I'll give you a social analogy. Imagine if Nazi Germany had been just a little bit more resilient, okay? Right? So in addition to systems having the capacity to stay the same, they also have to have the capacity to change. They actually have the capacity to transform and become something else. I'll give you an ecological example. If we look at a coral reef ecosystem, if we pump nutrients and pollute it and do a few other things, we can flip the system to be, rather than a coral-based system, an algal-based system. Very low biodiversity, kind of murky, and not much fun to scuba dive in. Right? But I tell you what, it'll be very resistant and highly stable. Okay? Right? So, just going back a step. So we need to be, in addition to understanding the capacity, we need to take a systems-based approach. Part of that is understanding the relationship between biodiversity and resilience, but it's also about adaptation. What enables species and ecosystems to adapt and even transform. And that's going to be particularly important in terms of climate change. And then, this is a point that, again, many people are making the same point, but any climate change impacts are on top of the existing threats, which for most species will remain the priority for some decades to come. And this really gets back to, and Isla listed them, habitat loss, fragmentation and degradation, what we're doing to the vegetation habitat of animal species remains the number one problem. The number two problem is introduced species. Most Australians are still absolutely ignorant of the effect of cats and foxes on wildlife, okay? Let alone all the other feral animals. And we're getting more understanding of the issues with altered water and fire regimes. There are going to be some species that are directly threatened by climate change, right? Like alpine species. Species that evolved and are dependent upon alpine environments are probably on the way out. But I don't know what we can do about that, okay? So I'm not saying there aren't species that are going to fall off the table, but those ones that do, I don't know what we can do about it anyway. But there is a lot we can do about this, and there is a lot we can do about that, and there is a lot we can do about that. And that will maintain the habitat for an awful lot of our species. And I don't have time. I was just giving an example in Northern Australia, but I don't have time to speak to it. So just keep going to my... Oh, and then my fourth point is, and this has already been raised, this idea about whether you want to call it connectivity conservation or linking landscapes or wild country. There's a number of terms that all basically mean the same thing. We need to be thinking about landscape ecosystems. We need to think big. We need to be thinking about whole of landscape. We need to be thinking about cross tenure. This term coalition of the willing, it was not invented by George Bush. He stole it from the World Resources Institute. The World Resources Institute proposed this as an alternative to the failure of national governments to advance global environmental issues. So that is our term. It's an environmental term. It's actually not a war term. And we need to be thinking about larger scale processes and what we've tended to do. So there's three examples of connectivity conservation initiatives in Australia: the Great Eastern Ranges, Gondwana Link and Habitat 141. And all of them involve governments, non-government organisations, national NGOs, but also local grassroots organisations as well. And this is a scale that we have to be thinking about planning and rolling out our biodiversity strategies. So finally, in summary, in terms of kind of science-based concepts that are relevant for framing biodiversity policy, I think we need to be talking about ecosystem-based mitigation. We need to be talking about ecosystem-based adaptation. If we don't, people will be talking about engineered mitigation and engineered adaptation, and a lot of that will be at the expense of ecosystems, right? People will be proposing that rather than using natural forests to store carbon, we burn them for biofuel. I mean, that's a good example of the situation. And I've already mentioned the example of adaptation. We really, there's a lovely British entomologist who talked about the habitat template. That's what he called the native vegetation ecosystems that animals use. We really need to protect and restore it. I mean, it's that simple. We need to have huge more investment in the conservation management of current threats. For Northern Australia, this is critical in particular. We do need to be thinking about adaptation as well as resilience, and we need to be thinking about connectivity conservation. Well, the one thing is that don't fall into the trap of, when it comes to biodiversity and climate change, of viewing nature as the hapless victim of climate change.